Welcome to this show on Gordon Brewster and his cartoons. You'll see in the illustration in front of you a website address at the bottom. That's my website, and on that website you will find some supplementary material, including this show itself. The website is photopole.com/Gordon_DCLA. And just one comment on the picture in front of you. Gordon has a habit of putting himself into his cartoons, and this is one such cartoon. And I hope when we're finished with this that you will have learned a little bit about Gordon Brewster and his cartoons. Now, this is the approach to Howth Village coming from Sutton, from Dublin. The train station is in under the bridge on the left, and the tram that you see there is on its way down from the summit of Howth Head, coming down under gravity to the tram terminal, also in on the left. Now, if you look under the bridge on the right, you will see there that the first building you see on the right is a single-story building. That's number 1 Harbour Road. The second building is a 2-story building, which is number 2 Harbour Road. And that was formerly a tea shop. And in the 1940s, which we are about to deal with, that was a newsagent's cum sweet shop. Now, we go ahead here to 16th of June, 1946. A man enters the shop to buy sweets for his children. He collapses on the floor and he's dying. The shopkeeper rushes out from behind the counter and says an act of contrition in his ear. The man dies. The man was Gordon Brewster, and the shopkeeper was my mother. This is a more modern view of the shop in modern times. Now, in looking at Gordon Brewster's cartoons, I want to comment first of all on 3 general aspects that apply to the collection as a whole. The first one is the period to which the collection refers and the frequency with which the cartoons appeared. The second thing I want to talk about are the caricatures within individual cartoons. And the third thing I want to talk about is the style of the cartoons and the detail that you see in them. Now, as for the period and the frequency, this is a bar chart from the website of the National Library of Ireland, where the available cartoons are stored. There is a collection there of almost 500 of his cartoons, of original cartoons. This represents a portion of his output as a cartoonist, but it is all we have available in terms of original cartoons, the actual originals. For the rest of it, other cartoons appeared in the newspapers, and I haven't analyzed them. So I'm confining myself to what we have available in the collection in the National Library, which is available online digitally also. Now, the period to which the cartoons refer, you'll see there it's 1922 to 1932. It's an important period in the life of Ireland. It includes the foundation of the Free State after we got our independence. And it also, that decade, includes the consolidation of the Free State. When it comes to the frequency, you can see a little 50 there on the right. You can see some of the bars are below it, some of the bars are above it. The cartoons were basically in the better cartoons were in the Weekend Herald. There was one a week. And there were also cartoons in the Sunday Independent, which were less worked. They were much more quick sketches. You'll notice that there are gaps. And you'll notice that in some cases there's more than the 50, and that's explained by the two sources of the cartoons. Now, partly the gaps may be explained by some of the cartoons in the collection being undated, and they obviously don't appear there. A second reason why for the gaps, or possible reason for the gaps, is that when Gordon died, all sorts of VIPs turned up at his house looking for copies of cartoons, presumably cartoons that they had been pilloried in perhaps themselves. And Gordon's daughter, Dolores, who was 17, handed them out to them. I mean, these were authority figures turning up at the door looking for stuff, friends of Brewster's, maybe even some of his enemies. And Dolores didn't feel at that stage in a position to refuse, but she very much regretted this later in her life. Another reason why there might be gaps is that when they lived in Balscadden in Howth, there was a fire. The house went on fire. And the reason the house went on fire was that Dolores knocked over a clothes horse into the fire. And it's quite possible that a number of cartoons, or even boxes of them, could have been lost in that fire. This is an example of a cartoon, and you can certainly see that there is some damage up in the top right-hand corner. Whether that's water damage or fire damage, I don't know. And some of the cartoons are like that. So there could have been lots of cartoons gone up in the fire as well. Now, why have we got these cartoons? How come we have originals at all? Well, this is from one of the cartoons, the later ones in 1932. And you'll see that the instructions that went down to the plate makers were that it's 3 columns wide, 5 inches high. And you'll notice the extra instruction under that, please return original. So with all the work he put into them, Gordon obviously wanted to hang on to the originals. And were it not for that, we wouldn't have those originals here today. Now, so much for the period and the frequency. I want to say a few words in general about the caricatures. Now, caricature is basically an illustration of an individual person. And in this case, these are usually politicians. So I've extracted some of them here just to give an idea. And the reason here that I have these in the way I have is that I want to give some idea of the relative importance of the geographical areas that he was dealing with. On the left column is from the Free State. Next is from Britain, the island of Britain. Next is from Northern Ireland, and finally, international. Now, the most frequent individual in the collection is W.T. Cosgrave in the top left-hand corner. He was the Taoiseach for that, or the equivalent of Taoiseach for that period. He personifies the state, if you like. Next down, you have Ernest Blythe, who was his finance minister. You have De Valera, only a few of De Valera. De Valera was basically out of politics until he set up Fianna Fáil and went into the Dáil in 1926. So he has a shorter period. And then you have Kevin O'Higgins at the bottom, who was the Home Affairs Justice Minister in Cosgrave's government. You've quite a lot from Britain. in the collection. And of those, Ramsay MacDonald, who is very caricaturable, so to speak, there are 17 of him there, and there's 14 of Stanley Baldwin. Between the pair of them, they were the Prime Minister for the period. Philip Snowden, there are a few, who was the Finance Minister, or the Treasury Minister. And then you have Lloyd George, who was in coalition with Ramsay MacDonald for some of the time. On Northern Ireland, you can see that you have 16 of Craigavon, who was the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland. And there are 2 of Joe Devlin, who was the leader of the nationalist opposition. And then when we get over to the international, you'll find there's 5 of them of King Alfonso. I'd never heard of him. There's 4 of Gandhi. There's 4 of Mussolini. And there's just 1 of Hitler, because Hitler was just coming to parliamentary prominence at the end of the period. And we'll have a look at that one later. Now, that's the relative importance of characters and of the geographical areas. As far as variation is concerned, these are not rubber stamps. I mean, he doesn't have a sort of a template of an individual and then just pop that template up onto the paper every time he uses that individual. He starts off with a blank sheet of paper and he does the whole thing from scratch. The result of this, of course, is that the individual is totally integrated into the scene in which they appear. And I'm just taking 4 copies there of W.T. Cosgrave, and you can see that they're quite different, each of them, and original. And I'm doing the same here for Ramsay MacDonald. Again, you can see that they're quite different and original, and I come back to some of them. Now, as far as the style and the detail is concerned, which is my third point, I'm using this one to illustrate that. The illustration here is of someone from the Port and Docks Board, who were responsible for the Port and Docks, obviously, and for Dublin Corporation, which had a wider geographical responsibility. And basically, these 2 guys are arguing about who is responsible for the safety at Dollymount Beach, and meanwhile, clearly, somebody is going under. Now, I want to draw attention in this one to, if you look over here on the top left-hand side, you'll see a structure. And if I show that in a little more detail, and I must say this is it's only a small detail of the picture, but it's something that you could put up on your wall separately and individually. This structure here is a Martello Tower. It's number 1 tower at Sutton. And Brewster was well familiar with the Martello Towers and their function, which were basically constructed by the British to defend Dublin Bay against an expected French invasion at the time of Napoleon. And he understood them well, and he explained them to his children. So this is just an illustration of the sort of detail that appears and the attention to detail. Now, having made those 3 comments on the general collection, I want to have a look at a few actual cartoons in full. I'm dividing these up initially into the geographical categories that you saw: the Free State, Britain, Northern Ireland, and international. So let's start off with the Free State. And this, you'll be familiar with this one, which is called a windfall. It's a bequest, a Haverty bequest. It's £750 at the time, which was donated for the support of Irish artists. And you can see the Irish artist there, who's very grateful for this serious funding coming out of the blue compared with the coins that are in his cap on the ground. Now, you may notice here that in no corner of the cartoon, top left, top right, bottom left, bottom right, has Brewster signed the cartoon. He signed all his cartoons. But what he's done here is, has always amused me. It's very clever. In the fourth illustration that he has on the ground there, he has actually signed the last one there on the right. This one, I have to say, is I'm very ambiguous about this one. This shows the Sean Citizen, as he used to be known in the Dublin Opinion. Sean Citizen, your ordinary bloke on the right, who hasn't a pick on him. And on the left is the mirror, not as how he sees himself, but how the Department of Finance in Merrion Street sees him, how the tax collecting authority sees him, and sees every citizen as a source, an unlimited source, if you like, of taxation. I spent my career myself in the Department of Finance, and that's why I'm somewhat ambiguous about this particular one. Now, this, I want to illustrate something slightly different here. The cartoon I'm talking about is on the right. It's some modern novelist who writes filth, as you can see. And if he gets a little more recognition from his audience, he'll write more filth. But the interesting thing about this is that on the back of another cartoon, I found a sketch, Brewster's sketch out of his idea for this cartoon. And as you'll see, what he produced was very close to his original conception. Now, when it comes to detail, I want to make the comment again on this one. If you look up at the balcony there, which is sort of in theatrical form, you'll see that these are very different people, very real people. I think myself that is probably Barry Fitzgerald on the left. It could be Lennox Robinson, W.B. Yeats is the other ones. Very hard to say. But these would have been known characters at the time. Now, a great preoccupation in the early years of the state was what we're talking here, immoral literature or filth or dirty books and all this sort of stuff. And this sort of stuff came in from pagan England at the time. And there were lots of moves afoot to institute a system of censorship, keep all this stuff out. And funnily enough, what I found myself when I was looking at my own family history and the Easter Rising and the period of the War of Independence and all of that was that the idealistic people among the rebels had this idea that basically filth, immoral literature, prostitution, all of this was caused by the presence of the English. And to some extent, they were possibly right, because there were a large number of barracks located in Dublin, and where there are barracks, there is prostitution. But what caught my attention was their idea that if they could get rid of the British, that all this stuff would go away, and you'd be left with a sort of a pure Irish race. Now, that clearly didn't happen, but they made every effort to see that it did happen, and there was a very strict censorship regime in place in this state right up to my day. But this is just one of the many cartoons that Brewster has on this particular subject. This is an interesting one in relation to the establishment of the state. What you see on the left here is the Mater Hospital, a major Dublin hospital. And what you see on the right is the Free State shelling it. Now, this image would resonate with a lot of Irish people as being in the style of the Free State opening fire on the forecourts, which started the Civil War in 1922. That's the style of it. But the subject of it is quite interesting. When we were part of the UK, there was a UK-wide register of doctors. You were on the register, you were recognized as a doctor. And the interesting thing about the register was that, given the status of the UK in the world, that you were basically registered as a doctor with international recognition. The Irish state didn't like this, and they wanted to set up their own register. And this was seriously resisted by the medical profession, because they felt that they were on a sort of a universal register, a universally recognized register, and there was this sort of small backward country were now trying to put them on its register, that nobody would ever have heard of them. So there was quite a lot of resistance from the doctors to that, but they didn't get their way at the end, and legislation was enacted to set up a specific Irish register. Now, this is Kevin O'Higgins. Kevin was the Justice Minister, the Home Affairs Minister, and he's being warned here by Sean Citizen to be careful poking around in the past. Like a beehive, you might get stung. The inscription, which is a quote from Kevin O'Higgins that Brewster has reproduced with the cartoon, reads as follows. People say, what is the use of telling these old tales and raking up the bitter story? But if we are to draw any lessons from our past, we must know our past. But Kevin O'Higgins did have the reputation for being a rather bitter person. This cartoon appeared in May 1927, and Kevin O'Higgins was assassinated in July 1927. So it's a particularly striking cartoon for people with a memory of Irish history. Now, that's as much as I'm going to do of the Irish cartoons in this geographical section. And I'm going to go on to Britain. This is an interesting one for me, because I take lots of photographs myself and I have an interest in photography. This is Ramsay MacDonald, the British Labour Prime Minister, and he's having his official photograph taken. There was a feeling around those days that if you had a pleasant tune being played while your photograph was being taken, you'd have a benign, happy expression on your face, and you get a lovely photograph. Of more interest to me is the thing sticking up out of the back of the chair, which is clearly designed to hold his head in place. You have to remember that in those days, we didn't have the high-speed films that we have now, and you had to sort of stay fairly still while your photograph was being taken. And this little yoke behind guarantees that. This here has Ramsay MacDonald on the left and Lloyd George, the Liberal Party. They formed a coalition and kept the Tories out. And you can see Lord Salisbury there, the Tory toff, looking in, looking very worried about these, what will I say, these low-class people, keeping the elite out of power. You'll notice that Lloyd George is reasonably dressed, but that MacDonald is certainly dressed fairly down market if you look at the patch on his trousers, and this is sort of a dig, if you like, at the British Labour Party. This is another cartoon on the same lines, the conservative cinema. So you're looking at it from a conservative point of view, and it shows the Labour government, if you like, being held to ransom by Lloyd George and his Liberal Party. And if you remember, or certainly I remember, because this persisted into my day, the Hugh Lane bequest of original pictures. Hugh Lane was an art collector, and he had collected a lot of original art of of well-known famous artists. He wasn't happy that Dublin had a premises sufficient to show off his collection at its best, and for that reason he left his collection to the British. Now, he changed his mind subsequently and added a codicil to his will, leaving them to the Irish. But there was a problem with the codicil. I don't know, was it not signed or dated or witnessed or whatever, but the codicil anyways, in strict legal terms, was not valid. In moral, emotional terms, it clearly was. So the John Bull is coming in here to the British judicial system saying the Irish Free State are at the door and they want their pictures. And the judge is saying, more or less tell them to go away. And you can see there that they're being battened down by the British with red tape and everything else they can grab. The inscription there reads as follows, which accompanied the cartoon. Regarding the retention of the pictures of the Lane bequest, Dr. W.B. Yeats stated that England has no defence whatsoever in the matter, except the pure technicality of the law. England has no claim to these pictures, and his statesmen know it. So that controversy lasted into my day, and eventually there was some sort of a compromise done that we got a loan of some of the pictures from the British, and we converted the municipal gallery in Parnell Square into what is now the Hugh Lane Gallery. So that will come up again in a little while. So that's the last of the British ones. Now, looking at Northern Ireland, it has to be said that Gordon Brewster couldn't stand Northern Ireland, the regime up there, a narrow-minded, bigoted, loyalist Protestant regime. And he hated them. And they equally hated him because he spent a certain amount of his time having a go at them. This is the Northern Ireland Prime Minister, holding to ransom, chained to a pillar, a Catholic young lady. And it's, if you look down at the bottom left-hand corner, you'll see it's signed by Gordon Brewster, but he has added after Ramakers. Now, Ramakers was a Dutch cartoonist who was famous for his illustrations of German brutality during the First World War. And Gordon has based this cartoon on one by Ramakers, which I will now show you, and you'll see how closely it's based on it. There are two differences, or significant differences, between the two cartoons. Where in Ramakers it's a German soldier, in Brewster's cartoon it's the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland. It's the same girl, clearly, with one small difference. In the original Ramakers cartoon, her right breast is exposed, but in deference to the sensibilities of the Irish Catholic state, Gordon has delicately covered this in his version of the cartoon. This is one I like. Stirring Times. This is the Northern Ireland Prime Minister in the Southern Taoiseach baking the one cake. This is reconciliation, or whatever you want to call it. But you will notice that both are wearing masks, smiling masks, which implies that the expressions on their faces behind the masks are somewhat different. And something struck me about it, but it may be more a modern connotation, and that is the shadows in the background today would have certainly very strong paramilitary connotations. So leaving Northern Ireland and now having a look at just a few of the overseas cartoons to get a flavour of those. This is Wilhelm Marx, who was the German Chancellor post-war, post-First World War. And Brewster has called it keeping his hand in. After the First World War, the Germans were trying frantically to gain acceptance in the international community and get into the League of Nations and all this stuff. And he has quite a few cartoons on that particular subject. But this is the Chancellor keeping his hand in, not just as Chancellor, but in case German glory reasserted itself. And in terms of detail, just looking at the picture on the wall, it's Kaiser Wilhelm, and it's, I think you'd agree that you could put that on your wall on its own. So, I mean, I'm just illustrating here that Brewster does pay significant attention to detail. Now, this is the only Hitler cartoon in what we have, the collection that we have. But in some ways, that's not surprising, because this was the period when Hitler came to prominence in the parliament, in the German parliament. And the note that goes with it from Brewster is that in German federal elections on the 14th of September 1930, Nazis increased their Reichstag seats from 12 to 107, becoming the second largest party. Now that was some jump. So that's the only Hitler cartoon that we have. This cartoon serves a number of purposes. It's a dig at Northern Ireland, the Northern Ireland Prime Minister there, with his scroll, The Penal Legislation for Catholics, signed by himself, and the friendly greeting across the world from a brother, a Russian. And you'll note that the Russian here is portrayed in a way that's not all that distant from how the Irish were portrayed in Punch in the old days. But the Russian is coming to embrace him as a brother. And the caption reads, "One would imagine that outside Russia, no government would be found capable of perpetrating such injustice and of penalizing a large and important section of its citizens on account of their religion." This was a serious, partly a go at the Russians, but a really serious go at Northern Ireland and its regime. This is a favorite, the relevance of which certainly lasted. It's from 1927, and it relates to the US attitude to Mexico and Mexican oil, where US firms were drilling and refining Mexican oil. The US took the view that I think Dick Cheney and Rumsfeld and those took in our day, wondering why their oil was under other people's land, and that the creator had really blundered there and his error should be corrected. So this is from 1927, and it's very much on lines that are still relevant today. Gandhi, I mentioned. I'll read this one. If the Mahatma, which is Gandhi, and his lieutenants are to be induced to take part in the Roundtable Conference, a necessary preliminary would seem to be that they should forthwith be set at liberty. In other words, they had locked Gandhi up, and if they wanted him to come to peace negotiations, the first thing they'd have to do would be to let him out. And of course, when they did let him out, what does he bring to the table? He brings a bill for recompense for the crimes of the British in their occupation of India during the Empire. And you'll see that comes to over £1 billion, as I look at it, which is quite a large figure for the day. And John Bull seems somewhat surprised. I think we would probably be less surprised today, having read a lot more about how the British Empire was run throughout the world. So having done that sort of geographical spread, I want to have a look now at just a few themes to give an idea of that aspect of the cartoons. My first theme is labor relations. And this is a cartoon which is not in the collection, but it's one that I came across. And it dates from 1913, from the Evening Herald. And it's Dublin city employers kicking out the workers, kicking out the representative, the trade unions. You can see Larkinism there, Jim Larkin having been the leader of the trade union. And vicious strikes. All of this is being thrown out, kicked out by the employers. This particular cartoon upset me. I had looked through the cartoons in the National Library, and I come to like Gordon Brewster and figured he had reasonably advanced attitudes to affairs. And here he was siding unambiguously, as far as I can see, with the employers during the Dublin 1913 lockout, which was a major event, so to speak, of the day. And that upset me. So I wondered, well, of course, you have to remember that he was working in the Irish Independent. The Irish Independent was owned by William Martin Murphy. William Martin Murphy was the employer who was most prominent in the lockout. And he was a hated figure by Labour in Dublin. So I wondered, had Brewster kept this attitude? Why didn't I notice this when I was going through the cartoons? Had his attitude mellowed in the meantime? So I had to look through the cartoons for some Labour related cartoons, and I came up with this particular one, which relates to the 1926 general strike in Britain. And you can see there that the attitude is that you want to get both the bosses and the workers around the table, and that this is the only way to solve these things. And if that's what you want, it implies, I think, concessions on both sides. So I was quite reassured that whatever Brewster's attitude might have been in 1913, that by 1926, it had mellowed, he had matured. This is the only cartoon in that particular collection with a religious figure in it. And this is an Anglican bishop. I'll read the thing first. It says, bishops who were living off mining royalties attempted to propose a 4-month moratorium. So the bishops during the general strike wanted the coal miners to continue working while there might have been negotiations going on, but they wanted them to continue working during that period because they were living off the royalties of the coal mines. And they proposed this moratorium, and of course the workers rejected it. And that's the rejection, basically, you can see in return to sender coming in the letterbox to this bishop fellow. Now, that was Labour relations. The other theme that I want to look at just is the Irish hospital sweepstakes. This was a lottery, basically, introduced by the Irish Free State to generate money to finance the hospitals. It was linked to horse racing. You bought a ticket, and if the ticket was drawn, you didn't get money straight away. It was associated with a horse in the Grand National or one of those races, and then the divvy out depended then on where the horse came in the race. Now, this sweepstakes was located in Ireland, but surreptitiously and probably illegally, tickets for it were sold outside Ireland, principally in the UK and in the United States. And these were smuggled in, smuggled out, funds smuggled back in, and so forth, prize money smuggled back out. And in later years, there were investigations into malpractice by the administrators of the hospital sweepstakes. But in any event, at this stage, it was fairly well known. And this cartoon, which is the whole world basically waiting for the results of the sweepstake, looks like an exaggeration, but in fact it wasn't really, because there was a vast amount of sweepstake funds that were collected in other countries, as I said, particularly in the United States and in the UK. And of course, there were different attitudes to this. The Irish obviously clearly thought it was great. But if you look at Britain, the British Prime Minister didn't think it was great, because it was basically undermining his tax base by bleeding funds out of the British economy, some of which would have gone towards his tax base with purchases. So he didn't approve of it. But John Bull, as you can see, who is the equivalent of the Irish Sean Citizen, he thought it was great, because he felt, well, as every gambler feels, I suppose, he felt that he stood to make money out of it. So that's Ramsay MacDonald again, and John Bull, where the interest of the government and the interest of the citizen may not have coincided. So having said that, I'm going to more or less leave the cartoons now, and I'm coming to a little bit on Brewster's personal life and his family. I'm taking as my text the tombstone in Kilbarrack graveyard, which is just down the road from me, and not far from where Brewster lived in Sutton. First of all, buried there are his father and his mother. Now, his father, William Theodore Brewster, who died in 1924, he was born in Everton in Lancashire. And in 1880, he came over here, and in 1884, he married Margaret McConnell, a woman from Tipperary, and they had 7 children, 4 boys and 3 girls, and they were all Church of Ireland, Church of England, Church of Ireland. By 1909, Gordon's father had become manager and accountant, the independent newspapers, and they were having lived in various places in the centre city. They had moved out into the prosperous suburbs of Glasnevin, where they lived at 16 Iona Road, and they called the house Audenville, because on Gordon's father's mother's side, the family name had been Auden, and that name was also kept on by Gordon's brother, who lived down in Cork, and was kept on as part of his name by another brother. So they obviously figured that had an importance. Now, Gordon himself was born in 1889. We know he died. We've already referred to that in 1946. His father wanted him, or assumed that he would be a doctor. But when he saw his artistic ability, he was persuaded that to leave that. And he was quite happy then with him becoming an artist and cartoonist, working for the Irish Independent, which of course was the father's newspaper at that stage. By 1906, this is Gordon at his desk. By 1906, he's in the Indo here, and he's become the chief cartoonist, and he eventually became head of the art department. Now, as I mentioned, if you look at his face there, you check out some of his cartoons, quite clear that he has himself in them. In 1926, he married Mary Elizabeth Burfoot. Now, he met her through the Yates family. Gordon was a friend of Jack B. Yates, who lived down the road at one stage. And Mary, the wife's mother, took tea with the Yates sisters, I'm told. In any event, they asked if Gordon would teach Mary to draw. And he undertook to do that, and no doubt one thing led to another. And it would appear also, I mean, Mary was a Catholic, and it would appear also that Gordon converted to Catholicism. They had 2 children, Dolores in 1929 and Richard in 1931. But the marriage broke up in the early 1930s, and Mary went off to England with a fella. Now, as far as Gordon's artistic, fine art career is concerned, the sentence in my family was, Gordon Brewster, the artist, died in the mummy shop. And I know that Gordon Brewster's own family, I know from his daughter and granddaughter, that they considered him, Gordon Brewster, the artist, whereas we at this stage, and me at this stage, consider him the cartoonist, which was actually the second level in his career. Now, he exhibited in the Royal Hibernian Academy in 1916 with you see there, the Tavern Fire and the Wayfarer. Unfortunately, during the Rising, the headquarters of the Royal Hibernian Academy, which was then in Abbey Street beside Wynn's Hotel, was gutted in the shelling that went on there. And that all of the exhibits were burnt, went up in flames. And this is just a painting from Mick O'Dee's exhibition of the 1916 Risings called The Foggy Jew. It's a fantastic exhibition, but in any event, that's Mick's painting of his conception of the fire in 1916. Now, to come back to Gordon's fine art, he also exhibited one painting in 1917, and this painting was called The Dead Rebel. I gather it was a rather large piece. It was based on a dead rebel he had seen in 1916 in Stephen's Green. And that painting hung on the wall of his house in Sutton until he died. And it has now vanished. As far as I'm concerned, it's not, I certainly can't find it. His wife came over after his death to sort out stuff. And she had a bonfire in the back garden where she threw into it any of his work that he could find. I gather there were nudes from early years, and I suspect that's where The Dead Rebel went. And this was a vindictive act, which unfortunately leaves us without Brewster's fine art. And the only painting that I could find, and it was Dr. Margarita Kapok in the Hugh Lane Gallery who found it for me, and it was in the basement, it wasn't on display, is this painting of an Irish peasant woman. It's the only thing I've seen of Gordon Brewster's art. I think Brewster, unfortunately, in some ways, will be remembered for his cartoons rather than his art. But at least we have the cartoons. And the cartoons are being rediscovered. This collection turned up in the National Library in the last 20 years. The digital collection, about nearly 500 cartoons, originals. I don't know where they came from. I'm finding it difficult to find out. But in any event, we should thank the Lord for small mercies and be grateful that we have these, because they are really very fine cartoons. And they, in recent years, they are being used in various publications. I just mentioned Michael Laffan's volume published by the Royal Irish Academy, Judging W.T. Cosgrave in the judging series. And he has 5 of Brewster's cartoons. And he told me that had he known, when I took him through some of the cartoons subsequently, he told me had he known of the full extent of the collection that he would have used more of them. A series called The Revolution Papers, which reproduced various documents and included various commentaries of the period, as you can see there, from 1916 to 23, which was the latter half of the, well, 3/4 of the revolutionary period, and of the period that's being covered at the moment by the decade centenaries. These revolution papers it was a periodic, well, I think it came out every week or fortnight, and there was loads of stuff in it. And they actually used 9 of Brewster's cartoons. You can see one of them there, which was the influenza plague of 1918, with death stalking the land. A work on the Halfpenny Bridge, would you believe, actually used one of his cartoons, strangely. I mentioned that Hugh Lane initially withheld his paintings, his painting collection from Dublin on the basis that there was no place to adequately display it. And there were all sorts of plans following that for the construction of a municipal art gallery. One of them was across the Liffey, at where the Halfpenny Bridge is. And this is Brewster's tongue-in-cheek suggestion that it replaced Nelson on top of the pillar. Now, I'm not going to stay with this here, but a lot of the problems that might be associated with this occurred to me along the way. I'm coming back just to this one cartoon in the context of Brewster's personal life. You'll see here probably a businessman who'd gone away for a few days, and he comes back during an election period to find his wall and his trees and the whole place plastered with election posters, which of course is a dig at the whole election poster thing and at both of the main parties, well, the 3 parties, I suppose, that were going up. And he gets an awful fright when he comes home to his house called the Grove. Now, I mentioned to you that Brewster put himself into various cartoons, and this is an undeniable example of this, because if you look at that house carefully, and then look at that house carefully, I'll go back again for that. Look at that house carefully, and look at that house carefully. And this house is also the Grove. And this is the house, a modern picture, but of the house that Gordon Brewster lived in Sutton, and the house that he departed from when he went to Howth the day that he died. So you can see that he's quite happy putting himself into the cartoons. They moved in there when Stranville up in Howth went on fire. I mentioned before that Dolores inadvertently set it on fire. Now, I know from Dolores that they had a happy family life. Now, the mother had gone when the kids were young. They were small. So that left Brewster with 2 children. And they had a nanny housekeeper who obviously looked after them during the day when he was in town doing his work. But he was he was a loving father, and he adored his kids. And I know from Dolores that they adored him, and they really felt privileged to having had a very happy life with him there. This is just a Christmas shopping expedition taken by a street photographer. in Dublin. And that's Brewster with the Christmas gifts, Dolores on our left, and Richard on our right. So I just want to say something about another name that appears on the gravestone. Gordon's brother, Lieutenant Richard Gardner Brewster, SIH, which is South Irish Horse. It's a regiment, a cavalry regiment in the army. And he was killed in France in March 1918 in the German counteroffensive towards the end of the war. He's not buried there. His body was never found, and he's commemorated, like my own uncle, and not too far from him, on monuments in France, on the Somme. He's also commemorated in Dublin in a number of places, and I'm just going to mention one of them here, which is probably the most dramatic of them. This is St. George's. This stained glass window of the Resurrection is in St. George's Church in Hardwick Place, which is just beside Temple Street Hospital there. It's a spire that you will see all over Dublin, from all over Dublin. And it's a beautiful window. It's a William McBride window. And if you notice around the edge of the window, there are these little reeds, and in the middle of them, there are apparently plaques in the middle of them. And I'm going to show you one of them from the top right-hand corner. And that is Richard G. Brewster that you can see there. He's commemorated there. He's commemorated in 2 other churches, and he's commemorated in high school, which used to be in Harker Street, and it's now up in Zion Road in Rathgar. I think that deals with Richard for the moment. Now, something that I would like to see, and I have to admit that I haven't really put my mind to it and made an adequate effort to bring it about, but something that I would like to see would be, first of all, a plaque at Gordon's birthplace. Gordon was born at 15 De Leer Street, which subsequently became the premises of the Irish Times. The Independent was just across the road at the time, but moved then to Abbey Street. I'd like to see plaque put up there. And I would like to see a plaque put up at the Gem where he died. These are constructions I did myself. There is no reality behind them at the moment, but I just mention it in passing. Just, if it's not too pretentious, I would like to dedicate this talk to Dolores, Gordon Brewster's daughter. I only met her for too short a time, for the 3 times during the period just before she died in 2016. I did a talk in the National Library, for which, thanks to them for my reproducing his stuff here. I did a talk on him in the National Library, and Dolores came over from England for it, which I was really thrilled. And she paid me a compliment that I will never forget. At the end of it, she said, you made Daddy alive again, which I really thought was lovely. But she was a lovely lady, one of the most serene people I have met in my life. And I gave the talk again at the request of Maura Kennedy in Pearse Street, and a subsequent time, and 20 Brewster family and associated people came over for it. So I really thrilled that the stuff that I've done here has actually been seen by the family and appreciated by them. So that's my talk, and I hope you enjoyed it, got something out of it, and thank you for your attention.